An English singer-songwriter, which is known professionally as Jessie J, quoted that sexuality doesn't define anyone, it doesn't define me, but rather, love should be at the core of what you do. Good morning, everyone, most especially to our dear MCA instructor. Good morning. To my dear classmates, good morning, everyone. So, my name is Divine Kimberly May Arasa Ganabi, and together with my co-reporter, Mr. Ruel Eliorico, we will be going to discuss to you about the sexual orientation. So, what are the subtopics to be discussed about sexual orientation? The first one is about sexual identity. The second one is about struggles for sexual identity. The third one is about heterosexism, toll on students and adults. And the last one is to identify the schools that value sexual diversity. So before we will formally start the discussion, let me present to you the objectives. So, for this lesson, the students should be able to describe the diversity of sexual orientation and stages through which people move to clarify their sexual identity. Second, identify the discrimination historically faced by the gays, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and queer, or the LGBTQ, and their struggles they have made for equality. Third, analyze the toll that heterosexism takes on the LGBTQ youth and educators. Lastly, to design strategies that value the sexual diversity among students and support LGBTQ students in the classrooms and schools. So to begin, let us first define what is sexual orientation. So this one will be going to discuss to us by Mr. Ruel Eliorico.
To start our lesson, let us first define what is sexual orientation. By definition, sexual orientation is a person's identity in relation to the gender or genders to which they are sexually attracted, the fact of being heterosexual, homosexual, etc. To make it short, sexual orientation is about who you are attracted to and who you feel drawn to romantically, emotionally, and sexually. It's different than gender identity, in which isn't about who you are attracted to, but who you are as a male, female, genderqueer, etc. So according to Buhan 1996, sexual orientation is generally defined by the sex of the person that an individual is sexually and emotionally attracted to, and includes heterosexual, lesbian, gay, and bisexual orientations.
And now, let us identify or define what is this sexual identity. Is how one thinks of oneself in terms of who one is romantically or sexually attracted, and may also refer to the sexual orientation identity, which is when people identify or disidentify with a sexual orientation or choose not to identify with a sexual orientation. So the fact that the population is not solely heterosexual is more obvious today than at any time in the past. The visibility of lesbian, gays, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning LGBTQ individuals as a group is higher than ever, and issues of LGBTQ community are now common in the news. When Indiana and Arkansas passed legislation in 2015 on religious freedom that would allow businesses to deny services to same-sex couples, chief executive officers or the CEOs of major corporations threatened boycotts of the states, forcing the states to revise the language of the laws. In the same year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that same-sex couples have a constitutional right to marry no matter where they lived in the United States. The U.S. population has become more accepting of the LGBTQ people than it is in the past. For example, in 2003, a gay Episcopal priest was selected bishop of the New Hampshire, and this decision led to the division of the church. In 2011, the military eliminated its don't ask, don't tell policy, allowing personnel to be openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual. However, the LGBTQ people continue to be harassed in the schools or even in the streets. They are imprisoned in Uganda for their homosexuality and are not accepted across the most Africa, in the Middle East, and even in Asia. Days of Silence, Gay Straight Alliance, or the GSAs in schools, and court cases against the school district for not protecting the LGBTQ students from harassment have highlighted the plight of the LGBTQ students in the nation's schools. Although the population is more accepting of diverse sexual identity, the local communities, religious communities, and state and national policymakers still continue the debate about sexual diversity and the rights of the LGBTQ people. What is sexual orientation? An American Psychological Association, or the APA, from 2008 defined that it is an enduring pattern of the emotional, the romantic, and or sexual attraction to men, women, or both sexes. The APA further indicates that different sexual orientation are normal forms of human bonding. After personal interviews about the sexual behavior of more than 11,000 white adults in the 1940s and 1950s, geologist Alfred Kinsey reported that 10% of the male population and 2% to 6% of the female population were predominantly homosexual. The figure of 10% continues to be commonly used to designate the percentage of the gays and lesbian in the population. However, recent data indicated that 3.5% of the population identify themselves as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. So let's proceed to the sexual differences. A sexual differences generally refers to traits that are sexually dimorphic, a subset of which differences is hypothesized to be the product of the evolutionary process of sexual selection. The sex differences appears during puberty or others critically periods when genes becomes sensitive to activation by major maturation events such as sexual debut, parenting, or menopause. So when most people do not think about their sexuality except in terms of the opposite sex and the stages where their families expect them to progress through dating, getting married, and having children. For most young people, no other options for their sexuality exist. They have not chosen to be heterosexual, and they have always been attracted to the opposite sex. They may not know people with a different sexual orientation than their own and have little or no knowledge about other sexual orientation. Heterosexuality has been the norm, with any other sexual orientation being identified as abnormal or even deviant. The term homosexuality was first used by Karl Maria Kerbenyi, a Hungarian social reformer, in 1868 and had become an accept in professional literature by 1880. Over the 100 years, the term homosexual and heterosexual became identified with the sex of two persons who were sexually attracted to each other. Many people viewed homosexuality as a sin, a moral failure, a sickness, or a crime. So why are some people identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual? Many people believe that biology has something to do with sexual orientation, and it may well play an important role. In pursuit of the scientific proof for the biological explanation, research have explored genes, the brain, hormones, and the prenatal chemistry to explain why some people are members of LGBTQ. In July 1993 issue of Science, molecular biologist Dean Hammer reported that finding the DNA marker on the X chromosomes of women, Hammer connected that marker to male sexual orientation but the research has not been replicated, calling into question the existence of the gay gene. Hormonal differences, especially concerning the rules of the testosterone, have been investigated, but the great majority of the LGBs have normal levels that match the heterosexual population. Some researchers believe that the hypothalamus, or the small mass of cells in the base of the brain, has something to do with it. Others have found evidences that there is a higher incidence of homosexual in some families other than the general population, suggesting that it is hereditary. Environmental influences such as a child rearing have also been proposed and a contributing factor to one's sexual orientation, but research has not confirmed this theory. One perspective with the LGBT community is that the reason one is gay or straight should not make a difference. Sexuality and or identity along a sexual orientation continuum from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual are much more complex than the political debates and scientific studies suggest. A biological explanation could undermine social justice initiatives such as equity and the right to be gay without being abused, which are important in the community. Identifying a genetic link could have negative impacts on the LGBT community if, for example, insurance companies refuse to cover people with a gene because they have greater chance of having AIDS. Issues of social justice are important in the daily lives of the LGBTQ people and their families. Let's proceed. Let us first differentiate this diversity of sexual orientation. So, what is heterosexual? A heterosexual is attracted to the opposite sex, while homosexual attracted to only with same sex. A gay. A gay is sexually attracted to men, while lesbians is sexually attracted to women. Cisgender. The cisgender identifies gender assigned at birth, while transgender is about psychologically sense of being of their gender and that doesn't match their genetic sex. A transvestite. A transvestite may also called as the crossdresser, while the transsexual is the one that is surgically changed their genitals. The intersex doesn't clearly identify their sex, while the queer still wondering about their sexuality. And lastly, the bisexual, they are sexually attracted to both sex. So what is self-identity? A self-identity is a collection of beliefs about oneself. Generally, a self-identity embodies the answer to question, who am I? A self-identity is defined as an overall vision as an integrated, coherent, and stable individuality, transcending the experiential and event content of self-awareness. Our sexual identity is based on the sexual attraction, related behaviors, and a connection with others with the same orientation. It is about how people decide to identify themselves. Most researchers agree that sexual orientation is established early in the life. As early as 6 years old, some boys and girls have a sense that they are sexually different from their peers. With the onset of puberty, they're likely to be attracted to a peer of the same or different sex. Young people are identifying themselves as the LGBTQ as early as middle school or different sex. Similar to racial and ethnic groups, the LGBT individuals appears to move through stages of development as they become more comfortable with their sexual identity. Because heterosexual are in the privileged social identification category in the society, they may not identify their sexuality unless they become aware of their privilege or become an LGBTQ ally. The first step for the LGBTQ students is to realize that they are sexually attracted to same-sex individuals which distinguish from most of their peers. Their feelings may confuse them, and lead to question the reality of developing sexual identity. The next stage often includes the exploration and experimentation as they determine whether they are a member of the LGBT, which could include testing relationship with those of their opposite sex. Eventually, they begin to identify themselves with a label or decide that none of the current labels describe them. When they feel uncomfortable with their sexual identity and are willing to face the possible discrimination and alienation that can accompany their disclosure of the LGBT, they came out to others. The last stage of the process is to develop the pride in their sexual identity. The new researchers suggest that identity develops along different trajectories rather than in the distinct stages, depending on the individual, his or her context, and the support he or she elicits from family members, the peers, and the members of the broader LGBTQ community.
So, what are the struggles for sexual equity? So, here are the struggles for sexual equity. Number one, states had laws that allow gays to be arrested in their homes as well as public places. Gays and lesbians are not allowed to teach because it is believed that they might have negative influence on the children and youth. Kinsey's conclusion on releasing his book about male and female sexuality has caused him to be widely attacked. Lastly, politicians and religious group leaders become overt from the heterosexual model. So let's proceed to the next slide. So, fighting for sexuality. So, the state of New York banned sexual perversion as a dramatic theme in place during 1927 to 1967. The next one, the beats where young straight and gay poets and writers who congregated at bookstores and small galleries in San Francisco during this period. Another one is sexual freedom and the celebration of their gayness were hallmarks of their subculture. In the 1950s, Evelyn Hooker began to question the pathological explanation for homosexual as a result of her study of gay men. But it took nearly 2 decades for the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illness. So these struggles for sexual equity and fighting for sexuality is to be under Lavender's care. We also know that these struggles and fighting are still present even today, but not as rampant as those in the past years. The next slide, which is the Lavender Scare. It banned homosexual immigrants from entering the country. Lesbians and gays were also being dismissed from military at a rate that rose to 3,000 annually in the early 1960s. This was the era in which gays and lesbians began picketing government agencies, including the White House, the UN, the Pentagon, and State Department. Feminists and gays were blamed for the destruction of the family as they fought for the equal rights, which many conservatives blame for the increasing number of divorce. So the Lavender Scare is the first documentary film to tell the little-known story of an unrelenting campaign by the federal government to identify and fire all employees suspected of being homosexual. In 1953, President Eisenhower declared gay men and lesbians to be a threat to the security of the country and therefore unfit for government service. It aided and accompanied by McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare, which are both anti-communist campaigns, in which led to tens of thousands of government workers to lose their jobs for no reason other than their sexual orientation.
Let's proceed to heterosexism's toll on students and adults. A heterosexism refers to the fear of or aversion to the LGBTQ youth and adults. It has historically resulted in the laws that prevented them from openly acknowledging their sexual orientation or gender identity. They have been victims of the crimes and targets of bullying and discrimination from their early school days, and sometimes in their own homes. So the way they have been treated in society has affected their self-esteem, participation in school, academic achievement, and college attendance. The great deal of progress has been made over the past 2 decades to overturn heterosexist laws, but much work is left to eliminate the prejudice and discrimination that prevents LGBTQ youth from participating equally in the education process. So let us first identify the targeted minority. In the past, heterosexuality was so highly valued that laws were written to prohibit any other sexual behavior or identity. Many regions of the country do not have legislation or policies to prevent discrimination against the LGBTQ person. LGBTQ people are frequently not admitted to straight clubs and are vulnerable to attacks on city streets and country roads. The LGBTQ are victimized by hate crimes in 20% of the cases reported to the FBI. Secondly, only to hate crimes against African American, the hope is that the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 will lead to the prosecution of the perpetrators of crimes that targets LGBTQ people, African, American, Hispanics, Jews, Muslims, persons with disability, and the members of other groups. Currently, statistics on the hate crimes and voluntary reported by the state and local jurisdiction, but thousands of agencies are not yet reporting data. Most hate crime will continue to be prosecuted at the state level. At this point, only 30 states have hate crimes prevention laws that include sexual orientation, and only half of those states address the hate crimes against gender, identity, or expression. Transgender women of color have been particularly vulnerable to attacks in vulnerable to attacks. In 2014, at least 13 transgender women were killed according to the Human Rights Campaign from 2015. LGBTQ youth may experience invisibility and isolation in their homes, communities, and schools. They do not see positive images of the LGBTQ people in their schools. The schools and local library may not have books and other information on the LGBTQ issue. They are not normal and are often hated by others. When the LGBTQ identities are included in the school curriculum, the focus is often on negative context that indicate all of the problems with being the LGBTQ. The LGBTQ youth do not learn that LGBTQ people have contributed to the history and culture of the nation and that their predecessors have struggled for decades for equality and for the elimination of anti-gay policies and practices. So now let's proceed to the LGBTQ teachers. The teachers have always been expected to be a positive role model for students, which requires them to be very careful about their social activities and relationships. Single teachers were often warned about sharing residence with adults for the same sex or of the opposite sex if they were not married. Such behavior could be declared immoral and could lead to dismissal from a job, especially in teaching. In a 1932 Education Foundation textbook, which is named The Sociology of Teaching, the author told teacher candidates that homosexuality was a contagious disease. Teachers whose LGBT identity was discovered could be fired in the many school districts. During the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s, teachers who have been fired began to fight back in the courts, which usually sided with school districts that use immoral behavior as a reason to firing those teachers. The tide began to turn with the California case from Morrison v. Board of Education of 1962. When the judges found the teacher's sexual orientation a valid reason of dismissal only if it contributed to the poor job performance. Many gay and lesbian educators separate their personal and professional lives for fear of losing their jobs. They worry that they might be accused of molestation, of touching students inappropriately, charged with recruiting their students into being homosexual or caught in a homosexual liaison. In addition, they worry about threats or being harassed, vandalism to their cars and homes, and violence by students, parents, colleagues, and other members of the community. Although courts usually protect their jobs, they cannot provide the security and the comfort that is needed by the teachers who openly acknowledge their homosexuality. When lesbians and gay teachers are silent about their sexual identity, they do not serve as a role model for gay lesbian students, nor provide the support needed by students who needs to be ignored by the school official. Heterosexual teachers who are willing to support the gays and lesbian students also may face discriminatory retaliation by others.
Schools that have sexual diversity. So here are the types of obstacles to reflect sexual diversity. The first one, student safety. Students should respect and support each other regardless of their sexual identities. But it should not be just the students, but also the teachers, the community, and the school should respect and support each other regardless of their sexual orientation. The second one, physical and emotional health. They are more likely than their heterosexual peer to engage in high-risk sexual behaviors or drug and alcohol addiction. As an educator, we should be sensitive to our learners in physical and emotional health regardless of what sexual identity they have. We should uplift them to become a lifelong learners and future leaders of our societies. So the third one is diversity and equity. Students should respect and support each other regardless of their sexual identities. In order to promote diversity and equity in our classroom, first we should reflect on our own beliefs. Second, reduce race and gender barriers to learning. Third, establish a safe and inclusive environment. And lastly, we should respect each individuals. The last one, students' engagement and academic success. Students need to be engaged in classroom work to achieve academic success, which will be critical to their future education, jobs, and earnings. As a future educator, we should encourage all our students to take up challenges and schools activities that will boost their confidence and academic success in the near future. So the next slide is querying the curriculum. So there are two mentioned curriculum. So the first one is the middle school and secondary curriculum. So social studies could explore the privilege of heterosexuality in a study of history of LGBT and their struggles for supporting LGBTQ students' equality. The next one is early childhood and elementary curriculum. One problem with this approach is that it is stereotypes. Another is that it limits students, reinforces gender opportunities to read stories, engage in play activities, and pursue friendship with children of opposite sex. So let's proceed to the next slide, which is conflict about LGBTQ inclusive curricula. Not all parents and communities view diversity of sexual identity as positive. Opponents raise their concerns in local newspapers and at school board meetings, but they seldom win a court case against the inclusion of LGBTQ materials. Why? It is because they are terrified that their children will be molested and be caught up in fostering homosexuality and gay affair. That's why most of LGBTQ educators keep their personal and professional lives separately out of fear of losing their jobs. So the next slide is supporting LGBTQ students. There are two of these. Number one is safe school policies. The overall goal for a school should be to treat all students with equal respect and dignity. A number of schools have established safe zones or safe spaces for LGBTQ students for this. So, the other one is gay straight alliances. Students with GLSEN study feel safer when they are in a school with a gay straight alliances or GSA, which is a student-initiated club of LGBTQ and straight students that provides a safe place for the students. Before we end our discussion, let us first have a short overview of the whole lesson. First, we discuss what is sexual orientation, which is about the person's identity in relation to the gender. Then we define what is sexual identity, in which how one thinks of oneself in terms of to whom one is romantically and or sexually attracted. We also discuss sexual differences, generally refers to traits that are sexually dimorphic. Then, the diversity of sexual orientation. Under this is the heterosexual, homosexual, and LGBTQ. We also discuss the self-identity, which is a collection of beliefs about oneself. We also discuss the struggles for sexual equity and fighting for sexuality, which are under the Lavender Scare, which is a documentary film about the mistreat of the LGBTQ working in the government. We also tackles about heterosexism's toll on students and adults, which discussed heterosexism refers to the fear of or aversion to LGBTQ youth and adults. We also discuss schools that have sexual diversity, which has the types of obstacles to reflect sexual diversity. Lastly, we tackle about queering the curriculum, conflict about LGBTQ inclusive curricula, supporting LGBTQ students, which is all about the problems on how we treat LGBTQ students in the classroom and curriculum.
And that is all for sexual orientation. Again, my name is Divine Kimberly May Arasa Ganawi, together with my co-reporter, Mr. Ruel Eliorico. We say thank you for listening. Goodbye.